Thank you very much, Helen. Thanks for inviting me again. Yeah, hi everyone. Again, it's me, Nadim, here to talk about another audit. This time we looked at Coinbase's CB-MPC protocol, or library rather. I think that's supposed to be CB-MPC. I'll fix that later. Anyway, this was an audit that was done with my colleague Daniel Bleikenbacher over at Cure53. We're an auditing team that's largely based in the EU, although we do have some members in other countries like France, where I live, and even Japan and some other countries. We're about 25 core members as of 2025, and we've probably done over 1,000 audits at this point collectively. I've personally worked on over 250 audits, probably close to 300 at this point. And this particular audit, again, I just want to make sure that Daniel gets the credit he deserves, was co-authored with Daniel Bleikenbacher. We both contributed as well as we could to this audit. So just a quick timeline to give you an idea of what we're talking about here. This is the audit for Coinbase's multi-party computation library. We were contacted in late 2024. The audit began in November, concluded in December. We finished confirming the fixes in January, and then Coinbase decided to publish the report, as well as CB-MPC itself, in end of last month. So roughly, I think it was March 28th, much to our delight, because again, we get to talk about our work, which is something that auditors don't get to do very often. And there's a general rule, which is that the more interesting the work is, the less likely you are to be able to talk about it, which is very unfortunate, because the audits that get published are the ones that don't have a lot of interesting bugs because the vendor wants to look good. This is my personal opinion, but in some cases you have vendors that will publish the audit and make a show of transparency and good faith and try to inspire confidence in the security community and the broader community by publishing their audits, and that's really good. And this is one of those instances, as was NIM, as were some others as well. So what is the Coinbase multi-party computation library? This is Audit. It's a bunch of low-level primitives that can be used for a ton of things. So Paillet is a additively homomorphic threshold encryption scheme. Additively homomorphic means that if you have two ciphertexts and you add them together, you get the same sum, and then you decrypt them later, you get the same sum as if you had added the two plain texts together. So that can be interesting in use cases such as cryptocurrency, but also the medical sector or any sector where you want to do encryption on data when you want to do, operations on encrypted data without decrypting it. And so El-Gamal is a similarly additively homomorphic encryption scheme. Those are really cool schemes. They've been known for a while, but they have faced some resurgence in uses largely inspired by the use cases that we've seen proliferating recently in applied cryptography when it comes to the medical sector and also the examples I mentioned earlier. There were also some secret sharing schemes like Shamir secret sharing, which allows us to split a secret key up to multiple shares and distribute them amongst parties. The use cases for any sort of banking or financial institution for such a scheme are pretty obvious. Commitment schemes that let you commit to some data, whether as a single party or as multiple parties. Multi-party signing schemes, oblivious transfer, verifiable random functions, and more. So this was really a Swiss knife of fancier than usual cryptography. Obviously, you've had many cryptographic libraries that have existed before, but they tend to implement rather standard cryptography, or what we consider as standard cryptography these days. Stuff like, I don't know, symmetric encryption, AES, Diffie-Hellman, post-quantum primitives like ML-Kyber or whatever, ML-Chem rather, also known as Kyber. But these are rather considered to be fancier encryption primitives because they're more sophisticated, involve relatively more sophisticated algebra in cases, or because they're used in more specific or fancy sort of use cases and sectors. So What was in scope? We were instructed to provide high priority coverage for the following items, which is basically all the library. And you had a few items like RSA where we were told that it's not as important to cover it. But we ended up basically covering all of the important elements of the library, including the underlying libraries for everything from zero knowledge constructions to the big num library, Paillet, Algamal, the additively homomorphic encryption schemes, secret sharing, and stuff like that. So this was a super, super challenging audit. And it was even more challenging than it might seem right now. And I'll get us to why in a moment. So why did Coinbase design this? Well, obviously, I don't know because I don't work at Coinbase, but I would make an educated guess and say that they were probably mostly interested in threshold signing, given that Coinbase is a cryptocurrency provider. Maybe they don't want to store all the private keys in a single computer somewhere. Maybe they want to split them, have some in an HSM, have some in a more readily available state, and securely coordinate all signing operations between these parties. There are obvious use cases for cold wallets, preventing the most common end user wallet compromise scenarios in case someone's phone is stolen, etc. And that would raise the question of why are there so many primitives then? Well, there are potentially other confidential use cases at Coinbase that we're simply not aware of. I guess that's possible. Or given, and this I say this especially given my knowledge of who's behind the CB-MPC project, they just wanted to engineer something impressive and give back to the community. And I'll elaborate on that also in a moment. So the potential use cases for such a library could be, for example, as mentioned earlier, to move customer deposits and withdrawals without ever exposing a full private key on a single host, cold to hot wallet rebalancing, so you can do periodic top-ups from cold storage wallets to hot wallets or pools in a more secure way. You can distribute staking validator keys for the nodes that Coinbase could be running. This is all conjecture. I don't know what Coinbase is doing. This is just what I assume that maybe they're using this library for. Just want to be clear about that. For their Ethereum nodes, Solidity nodes, etc. And many other potential use cases for this library. These are a slew of rather sophisticated cryptographic primitives, and Coinbase is a company that has all kinds of imaginable potential use cases, so we don't really have to think too hard to try and imagine some interesting, cool use cases they could come up with to implement these cryptographic primitives. So let's talk about the audit. Now, Coinbase released this library, they made it available in the public domain, and they wanted someone to audit it, and we're very excited that they chose to work with us at Q53. So whenever I get an audit, I've developed this metric, I guess, called the auditor's preemptive excitement level. This is not a particularly serious metric. I'm hoping it'll get a few laughs, but it looks something like this. So if the code quality is like horrible, you're looking at it, it's the first day of the audit, or you're preparing for the audit, and it's the weekend before the audit or whatever, and you realize that the code is horrible. So the level of excitement is very low because you realize that you're gonna just have a terrible time looking through this horrible code, and you're just not gonna have a fun time. If the code quality is, let me see if I can get a laser pointer here. Yeah, so if the code quality is bad, that's actually awesome. That's excellent, because it's not horrible enough for you to hate your life going through the code, but it's bad enough where you know that you're going to find a lot of bugs, and so you're going to have a killer audit report, maybe with some critical vulnerabilities. So this is really the best case scenario, potentially. If the code quality is meh, it's fine. It's an audit. If you're lucky, you'll find some bugs. If not, then not. The code is okay, and so you don't really know what you're getting into. If the code quality is good, it's basically the same as when the code quality is meh, but the code quality is good enough such that you don't have to go digging for documentation, you don't have to ask a million questions, you don't have to guess what a particular part of the code is doing, and so you run a chance of finding bugs as well, but the specifications are there, the documentation is there, everything's well laid out. The developers put in an effort to make the code base readable, shared all the necessary materials. And so it's smooth sailing, and maybe you'll find some bugs. And then you have the worst case scenario, which is when the code is too good. And that's even worse than when the code is horrible, because you're basically faced with a in case the audit is a week long or 2 weeks long, you're faced with 2 weeks of existential dread, or you're wondering if you're ever going to find anything because this code is so amazing. Okay, so this is basically what it's like doing audits. And I need to disable the laser pointer maybe. Okay. So this was basically the final boss of audits. This was a crazy, crazy audit, largely because this was Yehuda Lindel's team. And so anyone who's done a standard education in cryptography will basically have used Yehuda Lindel's textbook. He literally wrote one of the best textbooks on cryptography, is probably one of the world's foremost authorities on multi-party computation, which is what this library is about. And so you're dealing with not only work that was managed and directed by an expert, but the expert. And so when most clients don't even have specs when they give you the thing that you need to audit, CB-MPC came with over 100 pages of meticulously written specs in LaTeX. And if that weren't enough, they were backed with over 100 pages of theory documents. And so every single primitive came with this, but like imagine this times 10 or 20 in terms of pages. And then if that weren't enough, it also came with a theoretical justification document, which is another 20 pages of them explaining why this is provably secure, like which math they relied on. And this is not like something ripped off from a paper. Like they didn't just like find a random paper on ePrint that explains why a VRF is secure or whatever. No, they wrote it again from scratch, in particular catering to the algorithms that they chose to implement and the particularities of those algorithms. So this is the level of rigor that you're dealing with here. And so ultimately, during my career, I've been in situations where I've wished, when I'm working on something over here or over here, I've wished for better documentation. And this is like a sort of monkey's paw situation where you got to be careful what you wish for, because then you end up with something like this. And so evidently, on the auditor's preemptive excitement level, we are very clearly in the too good area. And as such, this was an absolutely terrifying audit to get into. So I realized when we got this job that I needed a plan. And the plan was to request all the documents before the audit started, if I recall correctly, maybe like about a month before it started, and spend weekends poring over them and trying to understand whether I have sufficient coverage of the thing, because I wanted to do a good job, largely because it's Yehuda Lindel's library. He wrote the textbook. I wanted to find something there. It was like a very sort of personal pride thing, I guess. But what can you do? That was the honest motivation, and so I made an extra effort when it comes to this audit. And so luckily, we had some findings, and we had one high vulnerability finding, one low vulnerability finding, and also a bunch of miscellaneous findings, some of which I thought weren't miscellaneous, like for example number 6, but then we agreed was miscellaneous. But yeah, this was the toughest maybe audit target of my career, one of the toughest for sure. And I'm very happy that we actually were able to get something to talk about at the end of the day. And it involved a lot of concentrated effort, both from Daniel, my co-author on this audit, and myself. And so let's get the low severity finding out of the way. And so ECC refresh MP, elliptic curve cryptography refresh multi-party, is a function that's designed to refresh key shares for multi-party elliptic curve cryptography. And it didn't check whether all parties share the same session ID and public key shares. So it didn't check whether there was a consistent protocol state between all the parties. And this would allow for replay attacks and potential state injection attacks, and in general could allow a party to corrupt the session. And so that was a cool finding that we found, and great. There's not really much more to say about this. The more awesome finding is the second one, and really it's the main finding of the audit, which is that the same function doesn't validate whether received curve points for public keys belong to the same desired prime order subgroup that's being established by it for all elliptic curve operations. And so this is a very classic vulnerability in many, not just elliptic curve schemes, but in general Diffie-Hellman schemes. And so there's this amazing paper, or in fact, no, I think prime order, I think small subgroup attacks might be specific to elliptic curve schemes. I'm not sure. Anyway, so there's this great paper by Cass Kremers and Dennis Jackson called Prime Order, Please, Revisiting Small Subgroup and Invalid Curve Attacks on Protocols. Awesome paper by some of my favorite academics in the field. And they go over this vulnerability in detail in many easy to understand, well-written, well-presented practical scenarios. And so if you're interested, you should read up on that. They also find an interesting attack in a system called Secure Scuttlebutt. But basically what this vulnerability means is that you can force participants to compute points in a small subgroup. So let me explain what it means. You're expecting a public key. You're expecting to learn the public key of the other party over the network. Instead, an attacker sends you an invalid public key, then sits inside a small subgroup within your elliptic curve group. You calculate the shared secret, and then let's say you have a subgroup of order 8. So if you calculate the shared secret, that's only 8 possible shared secret values. The attacker in that case can guess the shared secret by brute forcing it, just trying the 8 different values, and that way they know the shared secret. Or they can actually also learn information about your private key by repeating with different subgroup orders and then combining the results using the Chinese remainder theorem to narrow down the private key. So this is a really very consequential attack that has to be mitigated in essentially all elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman primitives and protocols everywhere. So great finding, very happy with that. Aside from it, we also found a bunch of miscellaneous issues. So there was a minor spec difference in how they did ED25519. It deviated from the official RFC. That wasn't documented anywhere. Probably worth documenting somewhere, especially because it made it deterministic, which is a big difference. Variable time branching and recalculation and modular inversion, probably important in case they're expecting constant time behavior. Inconsistent function tagging between the code and specification, just made basically typo level stuff. I'll get to the Paillet one in a minute. Missing parameter checks and internal functions, again, not a big deal. This is a minor optimization in doing batch exponentiation. We found an algorithm to make it faster, or an optimization rather that made it faster. And also we found some typos in the documentation, which is almost impossible to avoid when you ship your library with a billion different pages of LaTeX documentation. When you're as thorough as that, I would have been shocked if we didn't find any typos. So the Paillet one, I thought this was maybe not a miscellaneous issue, but then we agreed that it was. So any Paillet crypto system implementation will say that you have to ensure that P is not equal to Q, and that the greatest common denominator satisfies this particular equality. And so these checks didn't happen. And now they happen. They've been implemented. But the argument was we don't need them because it's extremely unlikely that these checks would not hold, even if you just generate 2 large primes, which is a reasonable argument, I suppose. Anyway, like I said, this is not a particularly long presentation. I'm hoping we can get more value of it from the Q&A, because certainly there's a lot of potential questions that could be had about auditing a target like this, and I'd be happy to answer them. But the findings were not particularly numerous, and really the only super scary / awesome finding was the one that had to do with small subgroup attacks. But I'm very happy that we were able to meet the scope and get comprehensive coverage for this audit, because this was definitely a very challenging audit. The bar was set very high by the client, and so we had to meet that bar. And so I'm very happy that we were able as a team to contribute non-trivially to something that is such a high level work in terms of cryptographic libraries from, Yehiel and Dell's team. That's pretty cool. And so that was exciting. The main takeaways I would say is that if you're ever wondering what you can do to provide auditors with all that they could possibly need and more in terms of documentation for your cryptographic library or protocol or any auditing target, really, you can just look at what they did, what Coinbase did for the CB-MPC library, because it was kind of absurd. They knocked it out of the park and more. So this sort of strong and rigorous documentation helps auditors find bugs and helps your project achieve a high level of assurance. If you remember, when we looked at the amount of stuff that was in scope, we had a good amount of time to cover that stuff, but we didn't have all the time in the world, right? So I think that if it weren't for the incredibly thorough, incredibly rigorous set of documentation that was provided, I don't know whether we would have been able to say that we can confidently have covered all of this, but we did within the time that was available to us. And so the documentation plays a huge role. And I would like to stress again, for anyone that's listening, if you want to get the maximum value out of your audit, you need to provide it with a good set of specs. Because if you don't, what's going to happen is that the auditor is going to spend, instead of spending 100% of the time or 95% of the time actually auditing your work and finding weaknesses and vulnerabilities, they're going to spend 50% of the time, or 80%, who knows how much of the time, trying to understand what the heck it is that you've actually designed, and then the remaining time actually auditing it, which results in less value for you. So you're not only harming your developer practices by not documenting stuff for your development. Imagine what that would mean in case you had to fire someone, in case you have turnover, and you have new developers and don't understand what the heck's going on. I've seen that many times. So you're hurting yourself internally, but also you're getting way less value from your audits. And Coinbase was able to get, I think, a very strong value proposition for their audits because they were able to come to us and be like, we have done so much to make your job easier that, it's terrifying, really. It's like an existential, it's like a monkey's paw situation where you have to be careful what you wish for. But in all seriousness, I really hope that anyone watching this will consider adopting a similar approach. Obviously, not all of us have the time to be this rigorous, but you can sort of look at it as the gold standard, right? Okay, so this is my presentation. Like I said, it's shorter than my last one because unlike the NIM audit, we don't have, I don't remember, like 50 plus findings or something like that. But it was an exciting audit, and I hope I can answer your questions. Again, this audit was done in collaboration with my teammate, Daniel Bleichenbacher. So, yep, that's all I have for you today, and I'd be more than happy to take your questions. And thank you again to OSTIF for the opportunity to talk about our work at Q53.